Hi, and welcome to the Friday edition of the Christian Science Monitor. My name is Pam, and here's your first article. How Latin American slums are leading the fight against COVID-19. Slum dwellers have received little or no government aid during the coronavirus, so communities are coming together to help the most vulnerable. A mask-making initiative is one of dozens of projects across shanty towns from Brazil to Venezuela, Colombia to Mexico. By Fabio Teixeira, Anastasia Maloney, and Oscar Lopez. Huddled over sewing machines in their cramped home in Mayer, a sprawling complex of favelas in Rio de Janeiro, about 50 women are on a mission to make 280,000 free face masks within the next 2 months, two for each of the area's 140,000 slum residents. The women, the majority of whom lost their jobs to the coronavirus pandemic, watched videos on how to make face masks and are being paid above the market rate, says Andreas Lopez, who coordinates the project for the nonprofit Redes de Mayer. Almost half of the women in Mayer are financially responsible for their homes, Ms. Lopez said over the phone, adding that the project is backed by 3 Brazilian banks. Now they are very happy and grateful to be working on something that has a higher purpose. The project is one of dozens of initiatives taking place in shanty towns across the region, from Brazil to Venezuela, Colombia to Mexico, as poor communities come together to help the most vulnerable during the pandemic. Latin America is emerging as the new epicenter of the novel coronavirus outbreak. The respiratory disease is spreading quickly through the region, claiming the lives of more than 31,000 people and infecting more than 570,000, according to a tally by the World Health Organization, known as WHO. Across Latin America and the Caribbean, about 113 million people, nearly 1 in 5, live in slums where health experts say COVID-19 infection rates tend to be higher due to poor nutrition, cramped housing, and ill health. But many slum dwellers say they have received little or no government aid to help them cope with the economic and health fallout, leaving them to fend for themselves and community leaders to fill the gap. It's a very tragic situation right now. Nothing significant is being done by the state, says Alessandra Orofino, head of the Brazilian nonprofit Gnosis, which works in favelas and creates technology tools for social movements. A spokesman for Brazil's health ministry did not reply to a request for comment. With limited access to sanitation and millions of people crammed together in close quarters, Latin American slums are especially vulnerable to the pandemic, health experts say. In those places where you have high human density and you have overcrowding, you have a perfect environment for transmission, says Frederico Costas, an infectious disease expert and professor at Brazil's Federal University of Bahia. In the poor neighborhoods of Argentina's capital, Buenos Aires, for example, COVID-19 infection rates are nearly 30% higher than other parts of the city, government's figures show. In Brazil, where Johns Hopkins University has reported more than 22,000 COVID-19 deaths, leading the WHO to label the country the latest coronavirus hotspot, about 15 million people live in favelas. It's 140,000 people in just over 4 kilometers, or about 2.5 miles. How do you social distance in this context? Asked Ms. Lopez about the situation in Mayer. Gnosis is helping community groups in Rio's favelas to set up crowdfunding campaigns to raise money to combat COVID-19. In late April, the nonprofit and other local groups hosted a live stream concert featuring popular Brazilian musicians, many born and bred in the favelas. The concert, with over 8 million online viewers, raised about $50,000 to buy and deliver food parcels and hygiene kits to Rio's favela residents, says Ms. Orofino, the head of Gnosis. Favelas have built resilience over time and are now deploying that, she said. We don't think by any means that this crowdfunding and self-organizing is going to halt COVID-19. It's just that we don't want to have the time to wait for the state to do something. Since the start of the outbreak, some governments in the regions have been delivering food parcels and cash payments to vulnerable communities. Colombia has allocated $120 million to help 3 million informal economy workers, while in Argentina, the government has announced low-income workers would receive a one-time payment of $147. Chile has announced emergency cash transfers that will reach about 4.5 million people, and the Dominican Republic has allocated cash payments to 1.5 million families. Meanwhile, Argentina, Ecuador, and Colombia have banned utility shutoffs for tenants defaulting on payments due to the pandemic. And in Peru, low-income homes were told they could postpone payments of utility bills. But many slum dwellers say that's not enough. Street vendors and other informal workers who have lost their jobs due to lockdown measures have taken to the streets in several cities, including in Bogota in Colombia and the Chilean capital, Santiago, to demand government help. After a deadly police raid in a Rio favela earlier this month, residents complained that the government was offering little aid to contain the pandemic, but was still engaging in violent police operations. As residents and activists call for more state aid, they are also tapping into neighborhood networks to reach out to people most in need. As Mexican officials began urging people to stay home in March to contain the outbreak, HIV-positive transgender activist Kenya Cuevas saw that many homeless people and drug users in downtown Mexico were going hungry. It annoyed me, so I decided I better do something, she said in a phone interview. Ms. Cuevas set up a program with support from a private donor to feed the homeless and other vulnerable groups, serving about 240 meals a week since the start of April. The shelter for trans-sex workers that she runs in the city's north is also feeding neighbors affected by the pandemic, giving out nearly 80 meals a day, according to the United Nations. As trans women, we know how to love and to love our neighbor, says Ms. Cuevas. We have always had that quality. City officials said in a March press conference that 90% of Mexico City's more than 480 soup kitchens remain open, and the government is doing mobile medical checkups in areas with high numbers of homeless people. In Bogota's southern hillside slums, among the hardest hit are Venezuelan migrants who rely on daily cash-in-hand earnings as street sellers. Unable to make an income during Colombia's strict coronavirus lockdown, many have been relying on their support networks of fellow migrants who keep in touch on Facebook and WhatsApp. When Venezuelan Milson Solano heard that one of her neighbors, an unemployed young migrant, got kicked out of his flat in April, she took him in to live with her and her family in their small apartment in downtown Bogota. He doesn't have the money to pay his rent, says Ms. Solano. If 6 people already live here, another person can too. You have to help when you can. This next article is titled Lessons from 2008, How Far Should Federal Aid Go? Congress wrestles with how to shape the country's post-pandemic future while avoiding mistakes of past federal bailouts, by Lisa Mascaro. Congress is at a crossroads in the coronavirus crisis, wrestling over whether to go big, as House Speaker Nancy Pelosi wants for the next relief bill, or hit pause, as Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell insists. It's a defining moment for the political parties heading towards the election, and one that will affect the livelihoods of countless Americans suddenly dependent on the federal government. Billions of dollars in state aid, jobless benefits, and health resources are at stake as questions mount over Washington's proper role, its testing and ability of President Donald Trump and Congress to do the right thing. These are the eternal debates in American history, says Richard Silla, a professor emeritus of economic and financial history at New York's University. It's a bit like what Andrew Hamilton was facing in 1790, he said, describing the plan to have the new federal government assume the Revolutionary War debts of the states, despite protests of a bailout. It was, he said, as Mr. Hamilton framed it, the price of liberty. As negotiations develop on Capitol Hill, the coronavirus response offers Congress an opportunity to shape the country's post-pandemic future, but also carries the risk of repeating mistakes of past crises, including the 2008-2009 recession that history does not easily forget. Mr. Trump and Mr. McConnell huddled late last week on next steps after rejecting Ms. Pelosi's plan. The Democratic Speaker set the table with passage of the sweeping $3 trillion coronavirus relief bill, which includes $1 trillion to shore up states and cities to avert municipal layoffs, $1,200 stipend to Americans, and other aids. "We could have done bigger," Ms. Pelosi told the Associated Press in a recent interview. With more than 38 million unemployment claims, the Republican response centers on kickstarting the economy to reduce the need for more federal intervention. Republican priorities are to wean Americans off unemployment benefits, to nudge people back into work, and to provide liability protection for businesses that reopen. Republicans want to eliminate the $600 weekly unemployment benefit boost, arguing it handcuffs some employees with higher pay than they earn at their jobs. Mr. McConnell also wants to protect doctors, schools, and others from COVID-19 related lawsuits, a red line, he says, for any deal. "There's a high likelihood we will do another rescue package," Mr. McConnell said on Fox News. "We need to work smart here." The political and economic debate stretches beyond the halls of Congress as wary Americans await Washington's next move. It was Federal Reserve Board Chairman Jerome Powell who counseled Ms. Pelosi to rely on historical low interest rates to go big, while Treasury Secretary Stephen Mnuchin warned of permanent damage to the economy unless businesses reopen. Washington has been here before. Staring down the 2008-09 financial crisis forced the House and Senate into a historical debate over the size and scope of government that still resonates today. Then, like now, countless Americans fell swiftly into the ranks of the newly unemployed, while the very foundations of the American dream, homeownership then, health now, hung in the balance. Then, banks needed a federal lifeline. Today, businesses look to Washington for help. Ms. Pelosi told the AP the biggest lesson learned was to be very prescriptive in how the money would be spent after facing a backlash that the rescue benefited Wall Street over Main Street. But perhaps another lesson from the earlier crisis was the voter revolt against big government. The Bank Bailout and Recovery Act sparked the rise of the Tea Party wing of the GOP. Ms. Pelosi lost her gavel in the 2010 election, and Republicans took control of the House. Many of the same Tea Party forces, including the deep-pocketed Koch network, are aligned with Mr. Trump's push to prevent state aid, reopen the country, and get people back to work. "The American people need to understand the choices they have," says North Carolina Senator Thom Tillis, one of the most endangered Republicans seeking re-election in the fall, during an online forum with the Koch-backed Americans for Prosperity. Mr. Tillis opposes Ms. Pelosi's manifesto and doesn't expect the Senate to act before July. He said of the GOP-held Senate, "We're a bulkhead against bad happening." Despite rare bipartisan support for earlier aid, the $2 trillion bill approved in March, neither side was particularly pleased with the outcome, the largest federal intervention in U.S. history. Polling, however, shows Americans favoring the federal response, even as they have some concerns about spending. An AP NORC poll conducted in late March found that elements of the stimulus package were widely popular. The poll found that about 9 in 10 Americans favored the federal government providing funding to small businesses and hospitals. About 8 in 10 said they were in favor of suspending evictions and foreclosures, giving lump sum payments to Americans, increased unemployment benefits, and suspended student loans. A mid-April NBC Wall Street Journal poll showed registered voters somewhat more likely to say they were concerned about the federal government spending too much on economic stimulus and driving up the budget deficit that they were worried that too little money would be spent, lengthening the recession 48% to 40%. The remaining 12% said they didn't know. The Democratic Senator Debbie Stabenow acknowledged the $3 trillion proposal is a big number, but she said on her drive home to hard-hit Michigan, the cost of inaction will be much higher. This next article is titled, "No Longer Isolated." Volunteers reach out with a phone. With a simple phone call, programs across the U.S. offer older adults social outlets. It's going so well, some cities may make the outreach permanent. By Jamie Stengel. For Del Kaplan, the offer to get calls from a stranger just to chat while staying home during the coronavirus pandemic was immediately appealing. "It gets pretty lonely here by yourself," says Ms. Kaplan, an octogenarian who lives in a Dallas suburb. She's been missing meals out with friends, family get-togethers, and going to classes at a nearby college. The program being offered by the city of Plano is among those that have popped up across the United States during the pandemic to help older adults with a simple offer to engage in small talk. "It's really just to give them a social outlet that they might not have otherwise," says Holly Rickman, a library support supervisor who is among about 15 staffers from several city departments in Plano who together have been making about 50 calls a week starting in April. Brent Blokey, a library manager who helped organize the program, said the city plans to keep it up through at least midsummer and maybe permanently. The people receiving the calls have various amounts of social interaction in their lives, Ms. Rickman said. Many, she said, talk about relatives who are in touch, so her call might just be one piece of the puzzle helping them stay engaged. That's the case for Ms. Kaplan, who regularly talks with her daughter, granddaughters, and friends, keeps up with people on Facebook, and has been participating online in her adult learning classes. But Ms. Kaplan said her biweekly chats with Ms. Rickman give her something to look forward to besides the usual. Lori Onfrio Collier has been making calls to older people across the U.S. from her California home as part of AARP's Friendly Voices program. Ms. Onofrio Collier said her goal is for each person she calls to feel uplifted and to feel good. Like the Plano program, the Volunteers for the Friendly Voices program guide people to resources if they need help from local groups for things like getting groceries. AARP's Community Connections site lists groups across the U.S. offering help, but the main point is conversation. Ms. Onofrio Collier said some people she has called live with a spouse while others live alone. She said conversations touch on everything from hobbies to vacations to happy memories. Ms. Onofrio Collier bonded with one caller over a shared experience. "We ended up talking about how, when we were kids, we loved to read so much that we would read under the covers with a flashlight. I get off the phone with a smile," Ms. Onofrio Collier said. She is among about 1,000 volunteers making the calls, according to Andy Miller, Senior Vice President of AARP Innovations Labs. Mr. Miller said some people want to help with technology so they can stay connected with their grandchildren. One volunteer helped a woman figure out how to play online checkers with her grandchild. "We're seeing a lot of that, where people are just trying to stay connected to family in ways that they probably didn't do before," Mr. Miller said. Older adults are among those who are particularly vulnerable to severe illness and death from the coronavirus that caused COVID-19. That's why health officials are encouraging people over 65 to stay home, even as some states loosen restrictions put in place because of the pandemic. "Some seniors may be the last ones out because of the vulnerability," Mr. Miller said. Ms. Kaplan, who retired 11 years ago after more than 2 decades managing Plano's senior center, said she and Ms. Rickman didn't know each other but found common ground in talking about the city and dealing with isolating at home. Miss Rickman said the calls have been a gift for her. Miss Kaplan said that when she feels it's safe for her to venture to places other than the grocery store, she plans to visit the library and meet Miss Rickman in person. Well, moving on to the next article. Why New Delhi's Sikh kitchen cook 100,000 meals a day. The Bangla Sahib Gurudwara has remained open through wars and plagues, serving thousands of people food. During India's ongoing coronavirus lockdown, about 4 men have kept the Sikh temple kitchen open, cooking up 100,000 meals a day. By Emily Schmall, Associated Press. And in advance, please forgive me for slaughtering the words. At first, the kitchen at Bangla Sahib Gurdwara cooked 40,000 meals each day for the hungry who live on the streets of India's capital city or who have lost their livelihoods to the coronavirus lockdown. But the need was greater than that. So workers at the Golden Dome Temple in central New Delhi made 80,000 meals daily, then 100,000. Soon they expect to be making 300,000, all provided free to the growing ranks of the unfortunate. For centuries, the faithful have flocked to the temple for its healing waters and a free meal at the community kitchen, the symbol of equality found at every Sikh temple complex and open to all visitors. The Bangla Sahib Gurdwara has remained open through wars and plagues, serving millions of people simple vegetarian food on the cool marble floor of its enormous dining hall. But during India's ongoing lockdown, among the world's most stringent, religious congregations are banned. Bangla Sahib has kept its kitchen open with the help of about 4 men who sleep at the temple's guest house to save time commuting to and from the temple and avoid the risk of infecting loved ones. They haven't seen their families since the lockdown began on March 25th. In colorful turbans and cloth bandanas tied over their noses and mouths, they work in the industrial kitchen 18-hour shifts. Head cook Balbir Singh stirs an enormous ladle through a potato and soybean stew, simmering with ghee and coriander in a giant cook pot. A machine that every hour makes 5,000 chapati, thin unleavened bread, whirls long before the sun rises and after it sets. Mr. Singh lights the flames at 3 a.m. so that 35,000 lunches are ready for pickup by 9 a.m. If we serve at this time, God will give us more. It's a give and take system, Mr. Singh said. Bangla Sahib is the largest of New Delhi's 10 Gurdwaras, whose kitchens together form a vital part of the city's strategy to feed the poor during the pandemic. The city government approached the Delhi Sikh Gurdwara Management Committee just after India's nationwide lockdown began in late March, according to the committee president Manjinder Singh Sira. Bangla Sahib, which usually prepares around 500,000 meals per week using donated ingredients and equipment, is quickly ramping up to produce 6 times that many, Mr. Singh Sirsa said. The government sends trucks to pick up the meals each day and distribute them to a network of shelters and drop-off points, but pays nothing for the food. Mr. Singh Sirsa struggles to protect his workers and collect donations to keep the enterprise going. This is the biggest challenge for me in my entire life, he said. Anticipating many months of hardships ahead, he appears nightly on the Bangla Sahib's own TV channel to appeal for more donations. A man from Montreal recently pledged $10,000. Another from London offered $100,000, he said. The dining hall heaves with sacks of rice, flour, lentil, and cans of oil. 6 months of supplies, says Jagpreet Singh, a temple clerk. We believe in God. He is giving us this power, so we provide, he said. Wow. Our next article is titled Points of Progress, Global Decline in Deforestation and More. In good news this week, South America's deforestation rates have declined and Europe and Asia are gaining trees, plus more positive headlines by Nusmila Lohani, staff writer, Lindsay McGinnis, staff writer. Deforestation has slowed over the past 5 years, according to a United Nations study released May 7th. From 2010 to 2015, the Earth lost approximately 12 million hectares, or 30 million acres, of forest every year. In the past 5 years, that number has dropped to 10 million hectares. The new Global Forest Resources Assessment shows forest loss rates are inconsistent around the globe. Researchers took into account major losses in sub-Saharan Africa, where population growth has exacerbated forest loss, but found an encouraging trend worldwide. This is partly due to a significant decline in deforestation in South America and more trees being planted in parts of Europe and Asia, which saw net gains in total forest area. More forests also now have sustainable management plans, according to assessment coordinators. Number 1, United States. Ida B. Wells, a pioneer journalist and civil rights activist of the late 19th and early 20th century, has been awarded a posthumous Pulitzer Prize. The special citation acknowledges her outstanding and courageous reporting on lynchings in the post-war South, reporting that placed her own life in danger and was widely criticized by mainstream media at the time. In the first 100 years since the prestigious award was founded in 1917, 84% of Pulitzer Prizes went to white people and mostly men. Nicole Hannah Jones of the New York Times, who won in 2020 for an essay as part of the 1619 Project on Americans' origins as a slave nation, said Wells is the most boss black investigative reporter and one of the most boss investigative reporters in the history of our country. Financial Times, the Pulitzer Prizes. Number 2, Central and South America. The Inter-American Court of Human Rights, located in Costa Rica, held a hearing in January on sexual abuse of girls in a school setting in the first case of its kind the court has taken up. The case is a result of 18 years' effort by Ecuadorian Petita Albarracin, who maintains her daughter was sexually abused by the vice principal and doctor at school beginning when she was 14. Her daughter died by suicide when she was 16. 3 out of 10 students aged 13 to 15 have experienced sexual harassment in schools in Latin America, according to UNICEF. This case could lead to the first standard for protection from sexual violence at schools for all 23 member states of the court. The case was filed by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights in 2006 after the Ecuadorian authorities failed to investigate Ms. Albarracin's daughter's death. The court is expected to rule on the case within a year. Number 3, Iceland. Icelandic whaling companies have temporarily halted whaling for the second year in a row. Iceland has continued the practice, along with Norway and Japan, despite the 1986 international ban on commercial whaling. The 2 Icelandic whaling companies both announced a stop in operation for the year 2020. Although the company's decision to halt killing whales is largely for economic reasons, it underscores the decline in whale meat consumption and rise in whale-watching tourism. In 2018, Iceland's whale-watching industry drew 345,000 tourists, a notable increase from 72,000 tourists in 2003. In 2017, the industry brought in $26.5 million, according to a report by the University of Iceland's Institute of Economic Studies. Number 4, Germany. The German parliament has banned the use of so-called gay conversion therapy on people under the age of 18. It is the 5th country to prohibit for minors the controversial practice of attempting to change an individual's sexual orientation or gender identity, following Brazil, Ecuador, Malta, and Taiwan, plus 20 states and some cities in the United States. Studies show that conversion efforts can increase the risk of depression or suicide among young people, and although the therapy has been debunked by experts around the world, the practice remains legal throughout much of Europe, Germany's new law prohibits conversion therapy advertisements aimed at minors and makes it illegal to administer to adults who have been forced, tricked, or threatened into seeking services. And number 5, Africa. Africa's black rhinos are slowly increasing in number according to the International Union for Conservation of Nature. Between 2012 and 2018, the population grew by around 785 rhinos. The gradual increase is a result of a number of conservation efforts, including stronger law enforcement operations. It is essential that the ongoing anti-poaching measures and intensive proactive population management continue, with support from the national and international actors, says Grathel Aguilar, Acting Director General of UICN. Poaching seems to have declined in the past few years since its peak in 2015, when an average 3.7 rhinos were killed daily. All 3 subspecies of black rhino are now on the rise. Black rhinos remain critically endangered, however. Well, after much thought that this article brings me, I have to tell you that concludes the reading of the Friday Christian Science Monitor. This is Pam saying thank you for being with us today. Stay safe, be blessed, and make it a great day.